Dear younger me, I'm writing to you at a time you had a paradigm that didn't belong. You thought we needed to move on without acknowledging our history. So let me briefly explain why you were wrong. Hi there, I'm Jim Thunder, and I'm continuing on with our video series looking at each and every section of the spoken word poem that I've called Dear Younger Me. This week, the idea to leave behind in order to decolonize our mind is the idea that we don't need the TRC, we just need hard work and equality. What I'm talking about here today is, starting off with, the Indian Act. In order to understand the Indian Act, we need to go back and revisit the idea of colonialism. So I've mentioned in the poem that colonialism is absorbing a nation by erasing its identity. Unpacking that a little bit further, colonialism is when a stronger nation sends people or settlers into another nation for the purpose of exploiting the people or the resources. How did that look like here, and how was the Indian Act involved in that process? Well, to begin with, prior to contact, there were nations all across the land that we now call Canada. Diverse and different and unique. In the same way that in Europe, you might see a person from Italian origin and a person of Spanish origin, and you can immediately recognize that there's a difference in terms of their language, their culture, their background, and all those types of things. In the same way, in Canada, you have the Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, all the different types of First Nations all across Canada. There are as unique and as different as any other nation that exists on the planet. What was the role of the Indian Act? Well, the Indian Act, first of all, was to take all this uniqueness and all these differences and to lump us all together in one category and call it status. That's where you see the origin of the term status Indian. That's because instead of dealing with all the different nations, they wanted to deal with just the people in one category. They wanted to deal with status Indians. That was the beginning of the Indian Act. And that's what its purpose was meant to do. Now, just prior to the Indian Act coming into existence, I'm going to talk about the numbered treaties. So in Canada, we have 11 numbered treaties. And the purpose of these treaties was to quickly acquire the right to lands and titles that First Nations people have held on to. They wanted to build a land from sea to sea in order to expand the economy. So they used treaties in order to do this. Now, the problem with the treaties is that they were not meant to be really comprehensive and to be really understood. They were just sort of, as some writers say, they were legal fictions because they were done so incredibly fast. If you look at, some of them are done within 1 year of each other, just like quickly stamping out these agreements, getting signatures and moving forward. What really should have happened is there should have been some time really taken to make sure that the groups that are represented by each treaty, that they're grouped in properly in terms of the geographic area, and that it was a clear and mutual understanding of what these treaties had meant, to even write them in the language of those who are signing them, to make sure that these treaties are adequately explained. And this never happened. So a lot of signatories to all the different treaties didn't even come close to having this idea that by signing the treaties, they're giving away the right to their land. In the video, I show the image of the two-row wampum. Now, the two-row wampum paints a picture of a time when treaties happened more or less the way that they should have happened. The two-row wampum treaty is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And in this two-row wampum belt, there's two rows of beads representing two rivers, which represents two boats or two canoes in which these two nations are moving along together side by side and never the two touching or harming each other. This is what the relationship should be like, should have been like, where the two nations are moving forward together, peaceably and sharing the land. And this is the idea that has been understood by Indigenous nations ever since. The idea that we are having these sacred agreements where we are sharing and we are working together. But that's not what our numbered treaties were. Our numbered treaties were quick deals that were done to transfer title over so that Canada can continue in its role of colonization. Now, while these treaties were being signed, the Indian Act rolled out at the same time. So this is the same as building a house and making renovations the way that you want while the inhabitants are still living there, while you are working out and negotiating agreements simultaneously. Absolutely not the way it should be done. The role of the Indian Act and its entire purpose was assimilation, and it was not done in any way in consultation with the First Nations people that lived in this land. So I want to talk about, just to give you a brief understanding of the Indian Act, I'm going to talk about 4 policies. The first, I'm going to talk about the permit system. The permit system was the idea that you cannot buy or sell anything without having the permission of the federal government. You needed your Indian agent's permission before you bought and sell things. The pass system. Now, the pass system is what I highlight more in this spoken word poem. And this is talking about the idea that First Nations people were not allowed to leave the reserves that they were assigned to. They needed a permit to actually get up and to go even do things that they have done for hundreds and thousands of years, like hunting. In the video, I talk about a time when I first learned about this. I was reading about this system in a book, and I turned the page and I saw an actual pass that was filled and signed by somebody who was requesting to go out and to hunt on his traditional lands that his people have been doing for thousands of years. And to me, when I read that, it just struck me with such a sense of loss and shame and just deep sadness that our federal government actually did this to our First Nations people. It was just an incredible moment of just the lights going on. But this was not the extent of the Indian Act. We also had this policy called severalty. So severalty was the idea that, we couldn't work together. We couldn't work together to purchase, farm equipment or anything. It was the idea to separate us so that we couldn't advance together. Another one was the peasant farming policy. So this idea was that because we were savages, we had to be gradually brought into a civilized state. And so we couldn't purchase labor-saving equipment. We couldn't advance in farming. So if you ask, this whole idea that we just need to work hard and hard work will advance us. Well, we were hard-working people for centuries. But when you have policies like the peasant farming policy that literally just pulls out the ground from beneath us and prevents us from being successful farmers on purpose so that other Canadians can advance and do well economically through agriculture, it doesn't make sense, because this Indian Act has really intentionally been a focus of assimilating us, preventing us from, no matter how hard we work, to advance. And so at the end of this spoken word section, I talk about how our economies have been destroyed. And that's exactly what's happened. It's been intentionally destroyed. And what are we doing now? We're working hard to rebuild our economies, to rebuild our structures, to rebuild our people. And the Indian Act still exists today. It's existed from 1876 up until today. It's had its revisions, but that document is still there. So in order for us to move forward in reconciliation, we have to quit these old stereotypes, and we have to actually understand what documents are in place, what policies are in place, both historically and today, that prevent us from moving forward. If we want to advance reconciliation in this nation, we need a greater number of Canadians looking into these things, challenging stereotypes, and to look constructively with us on how we can build a better future together. Thanks for watching.